I still hear the sound sometimes, that hollow, mechanical rhythm of the ventilator pumping air into my mother's lungs. It plays in my head like a broken metronome. Beep. Breathe. Silence. That's what death sounded like in 2020. When the coronavirus spread like wildfire, I was 23. I was living in a small apartment in Boston, finishing my last year of graduate school in data analytics. My mother, Grace Monroe, was a respiratory therapist, the kind of person who ran toward danger instead of away from it. She used to come home exhausted but smiling, saying, "If I can help one more person breathe, it's worth it." Until she couldn't breathe herself. The day she got sick, I begged her to take time off. She laughed, said her patients needed her. 2 weeks later, she was the patient. When I went to the hospital, they made me stop at the door. No visitors. No contact. I watched her through a glass wall, lying still under a thin white sheet, wires covering her like ivy. I called out her name, even though I knew she couldn't hear me through the mask, the glass, the distance. It's strange how quiet hospitals can be when the world outside is falling apart. Nurses moved like ghosts. The smell of sanitizer mixed with panic. And in that silence, I realized I couldn't do anything. Nothing. That was the moment something inside me snapped. She died on a Tuesday morning. The nurse held up a tablet so I could see her one last time. My mother tried to smile, her lips trembling under the oxygen mask, and mouthed something I couldn't fully hear. Later, I figured out what it was. Be smarter than it. I didn't cry that day. I didn't scream. I just stood there, numb, staring at the glass reflection of my own face, the daughter of a woman who gave her life to a system that didn't care enough to protect her. Her funeral was small. 10 people, standing apart in a parking lot. Everyone wore masks. There was no music, no hugging, no closure. I spoke to a camera so friends and family could watch online. When the live stream ended, I was the last one left. The parking lot was empty except for me and the echo of my promise. Her death would not be in vain. After that, time blurred. I packed up her apartment slowly, one memory at a time. Her favorite mug. The scarf she wore every winter. The stethoscope still hanging on the wall. Every object felt heavier than it should have, as if her presence was hiding inside it. I couldn't stay there. The silence was too loud. So I threw myself into work. I had been interning as a junior analyst for a small medical data startup. The CEO called us a family, but when profits dipped, he fired half the staff, over Zoom. No warning, no severance. Just a cold smile and the words "tough times." That was when grief hardened into anger. Not the kind that explodes. The kind that sharpens. I spent nights staring at spreadsheets of infection data, tracing numbers, patterns, lies. Governments were manipulating reports to hide the truth. Hospitals underreported deaths to protect funding. It was all there, buried in numbers. My mother hadn't died because of fate. She'd died because people in power decided data mattered more than lives. I started posting online under a pseudonym, sharing transparent data models, exposing inconsistencies in national reports. At first, no one cared. Then one of my models went viral for predicting a surge that the CDC had missed. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know who I was. I got offers, research labs, think tanks, even a political campaign. They all said the same thing: we could use someone like you. I didn't trust any of them. But one offer stood out, a senator from California named Alexander Ward. He was known for pushing healthcare reform. His campaign manager called me, saying they needed someone who could make the numbers speak truth. That phrase stuck with me. So I joined. At 24, I became the youngest data strategist on a major campaign. I stayed quiet, watched, learned. The political world was a different kind of disease, one that spread through smiles and handshakes. But numbers were my weapon, and I knew how to use them. When Senator Ward won, I joined his transition team. My job was to analyze healthcare data and recommend reform strategies. I worked 16-hour days, running on caffeine and fury. I didn't make friends. I didn't go out. I just kept building, piece by piece, a map of how the system had failed my mother, and how I could fix it. But the deeper I dug, the darker it got. I found emails, memos, deals buried behind corporate partnerships, hospitals underfunded while suppliers made millions. The people dying weren't just victims of a virus. They were victims of greed. That was when I made my second promise, this time to myself. I wasn't just going to fix the system. I was going to break it and rebuild it from the ground up. By 27, I had a reputation. Some called me a prodigy. Others called me dangerous. The truth was somewhere in between. When the president asked to meet me, I didn't know what to expect. He was older, sharp, one of those leaders who could make you feel small just by standing near him. He asked me about my models, about the reform plans I was drafting. Then he said something I'll never forget. "The world needs new rules, Emily. Maybe you're the one to write them." It sounded like a compliment, but it was also a warning. Because when you start changing the rules, people notice. And the people who built the old world don't give up their power easily. Still, I said yes. Within months, I was appointed as Deputy Director of Global Health Initiatives. It was the first real seat at the table. The first time I felt like I could actually do something. But every meeting was a battlefield, politicians arguing about budgets, corporate lobbyists whispering about economic priorities, all while hospitals still struggled to recover. I realized then that reform wasn't enough. You can't cure a disease that's rooted in greed. You have to cut it out completely. So I started preparing for that. Quietly. Strategically. I built alliances with young policymakers, doctors, researchers, people who still cared. We started a think tank disguised as a policy group, but it was more than that. It was a movement. We called it the Reconstruction Project. Our goal was to rebuild the world's healthcare system from the ashes, transparent, data-driven, corruption-proof. Most people thought it was just idealism. They didn't know it was revenge. By 29, I'd gained so much influence that even the president took notice. When the vice president suddenly resigned for personal reasons, my name came up. Some said it was impossible. Too young. Too risky. Too unpredictable. And yet, the vote passed. I became the youngest vice president in the history of the country. Cameras flashed. Reporters cheered. But all I could think, standing on that stage with my hand on the Bible, was of my mother, her voice, her strength, her last breath. Be smarter than it. I was. And now, I had power. Real power. But power doesn't make the world safer. It makes the fight bigger. Because the moment you hold it, everyone wants to take it from you. And they were about to learn that I wasn't the scared daughter standing behind the glass anymore. I was the storm coming for them all. When I became vice president, I thought power would feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like a spotlight. Every step I took was watched, analyzed, twisted into headlines before I even finished the sentence. At first, I played along. I smiled for cameras, shook hands with people who'd once ignored me, and said all the right words about unity and progress. The truth was, I didn't care about unity. I cared about justice. I'd spent too many nights watching the world bury its guilt under excuses. It was time to drag it into the light. My first goal was clear. Fix healthcare. Not patch it, not repaint it, rebuild it completely. I called it the Reconstruction Project. It was based on the system I'd designed years earlier, the one the old guard had called too radical. The irony was that now they had to act like they supported it, because opposing the young vice president who lost her mother to the pandemic was political suicide. I spent my first 6 months pushing every inch of my plan through Congress. I restructured hospital funding to bypass private insurers. I forced medical corporations to disclose their profits publicly. I froze billions in untraceable contracts and redirected that money to emergency response networks. Every move I made sent a shockwave through the system. Every success made me another enemy. The pharmaceutical giants started fighting back first. Their lobbyists filled the halls like shadows, whispering in ears, offering donations, promising power. I wasn't surprised. I was ready for it. One of them, a smooth-talking executive named Raymond Cole, came to my office late one evening. He smiled like he was doing me a favor just by showing up. He said he admired my passion, that he'd lost someone during the pandemic too. Then he told me that if I slowed down the reforms, they could make sure my political future stayed bright. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the city glowing beneath us. Then I told him the truth, that my political future didn't exist without destroying everything his company stood for. He didn't smile after that. 2 days later, rumors about me started leaking online. They said I'd falsified data, that I had financial ties to foreign interests, that I'd manipulated pandemic numbers for personal gain. All lies, but lies spread faster than facts. I knew where it came from. And I knew what I had to do. I didn't defend myself in the media. I didn't hold a press conference. Instead, I released every corporate email and government memo I'd collected over the past 5 years. Thousands of pages of evidence, corruption, secret funding, backroom deals, the truth behind how much money death had made for the powerful. It hit like an earthquake. Stock markets crashed. Executives resigned. Politicians who had smiled beside me on stage were suddenly silent. The same reporters who doubted me the week before now called me a hero. But I wasn't a hero. I was just keeping a promise. For a few days, it felt like victory. Then the counterattack came. The president called me into the Oval Office. He looked tired, angry, and older than I'd ever seen him. He said I'd gone too far. He said leadership required balance, that chaos wasn't reform. I asked him how many people had to die before balance mattered more than truth. He didn't answer. He just said, "You're playing with fire, Emily." Maybe I was. But I'd already learned that sometimes fire is the only way to burn rot out of a dying structure. The next week, Congress froze half my initiatives. The Reconstruction Project was suddenly under review. My allies started receiving threats. Some resigned. Some disappeared from the spotlight completely. I didn't stop. I couldn't. That was when I made the most dangerous decision of my career. I went around them. Using executive emergency authority, I enacted a global transparency directive. Every country that accepted U.S. medical aid would have to share public health data in real time, no filters, no censorship, no manipulation. It was a digital window into the truth, and I made sure it couldn't be shut. The world exploded. Some nations applauded. Others called it a violation of sovereignty. But the data was undeniable. For the first time in history, people could see the truth, the real numbers of who lived, who died, and who profited. Millions marched. Governments fell. Corporations collapsed under lawsuits and public fury. The old world was trembling, and I stood in the center of it, watching the walls crack. Then came the night that changed everything. I was leaving a late briefing when my car was stopped in the middle of the street. My security detail rushed forward, and that's when I saw it, a small, handwritten note left under the windshield wiper. No threats. No demands. Just 3 words. "You're next, Grace." They had used my mother's name. That was the moment I understood what I was up against. This wasn't politics anymore. It was war. I went back to my office and sat there in the dark, staring at the city lights outside. I thought about my mother's hands, the ones that used to hold mine when I was scared. I thought about the glass that separated us in that hospital. I thought about the promise I made in that parking lot. They could call me ruthless. They could call me dangerous. They could call me everything they wanted. But they would never call me powerless again. So I did what I'd been preparing for all along. I stopped waiting for permission. That night, I set my next plan in motion, one that would cross every line they thought I wouldn't dare to touch. One that would make the entire world remember the name Grace Monroe. Power doesn't destroy people. It reveals them. When I look back now, I know that was the moment everything started to shift. I stopped being the woman fighting the system. I became the system. After that night, the note with my mother's name on it, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office until dawn, watching the sun rise over the Capitol. The sky looked blood orange that morning, like the world itself was warning me. By the time my staff came in, I already knew what I was going to do. The reconstruction project wasn't enough anymore. It had exposed the corruption, but corruption grows back. Like weeds. You can't just cut it. You have to tear it out by the roots. So I decided to create something new. Something that couldn't be controlled by money or politics or fear. I called it the Covenant. Publicly, it was described as a coalition of nations focused on pandemic recovery and global health stability. But underneath, it was much more. It was a network, data analysts, scientists, cybersecurity experts, economists, and reformists from every continent, all connected through one encrypted system I'd quietly built for years. We shared information freely, without political filters. We used artificial intelligence to track global corruption, financial manipulation, and supply chains. And when we found something wrong, we didn't wait for governments to act. We leaked it. Anonymous, fast, relentless. Within months, the world started changing. Pharmaceutical giants lost their monopolies. Entire health ministries were dissolved and rebuilt under citizen oversight. Aid flowed directly to clinics and hospitals instead of getting buried under red tape. People began calling it the Monroe model. It should have felt like victory. But it didn't. Because the more power the Covenant gained, the more I realized how fragile the world really was. The systems I was breaking weren't just corrupt, they were interconnected. When one country fell, it dragged others with it. Economies crashed. Markets burned. And every headline carried my name. The hero who became a threat. The reformer who went too far. The vice president who forgot her place. The president called me in again. This time, he didn't sit down. He told me the world was collapsing under my reforms, that global trade was freezing, that leaders were calling me a destabilizing force. I told him that maybe the world deserved to collapse. He said I was risking everything. I said I'd already lost everything that mattered. That was the last real conversation we ever had. A week later, I went to Geneva for an international summit. Security was tighter than ever. I stood before representatives from 50 countries, each one staring at me like I was both savior and villain. I gave a speech that was supposed to be diplomatic. It wasn't. I told them the truth, that humanity had built an empire on greed and negligence, and now it was time to pay for it. That no government had the right to hide behind sovereignty when their people were dying. That accountability wasn't tyranny. It was justice. The room erupted in chaos. Some clapped. Others shouted. Cameras flashed as delegates stormed out. But that speech went viral. And suddenly, the world wasn't divided by borders anymore, it was divided by belief. On one side were those who saw me as a savior. The people who'd lost family like I did. The ones who believed the old world needed to burn before something better could rise. On the other side were the powerful. The ones who built that old world and refused to let it go. And between them stood me. The Covenant grew faster than even I had planned. It wasn't just data and policy anymore, it became a movement. Young people took to the streets carrying banners with my name. Scientists quit their jobs at corrupt corporations to join us. Leaks poured in from every corner of the globe. I stopped being a vice president. I became something else entirely, a symbol. And symbols are dangerous. The attack started soon after. Cyber assaults. Fake scandals. Fabricated recordings. Every day was a new attempt to destroy me. But the Covenant fought back harder. Every time they tried to silence us, we came back stronger. Until one night, everything changed again. It was 2:14 in the morning when my head of cyber operations burst into my office, pale and shaking. He said someone had breached our network. A coordinated strike. Not random hackers, state-level precision. The entire Covenant database was under attack. If they succeeded, everything, every reform, every document, every name, would be exposed. And with it, millions of lives. I looked him straight in the eye and said 2 words. Shut it down. He froze. If we shut down the network, we'd lose everything. Years of progress. Billions in infrastructure. But if we didn't, we'd lose control, and the people we'd sworn to protect would pay the price. So I made the call. We wiped everything. The servers, the backups, the data, gone. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made. Watching everything I'd built turn to dust in a single night felt like losing my mother all over again. But it saved us. The hackers got nothing. And when the system rebooted days later, the Covenant returned stronger, more secure, more hidden than ever before. That's when I realized something. I had created a ghost. A living, breathing force that couldn't be destroyed, because it didn't exist on paper anymore. It existed in people. In belief. In anger. My revenge had turned into a revolution. And for the first time, I began to wonder what that meant for me. At night, I'd walk the empty halls of the White House, my footsteps echoing off marble floors. The portraits of past leaders stared down at me like silent judges. Sometimes I'd whisper to them, half joking, half serious. I'm not like you. I'm not here to lead. I'm here to end what you built. I'd look at my reflection in the window, the lights of Washington behind me, and I'd see the difference. They led for power. I led for revenge. But even I knew, revenge doesn't stay clean forever. And soon, I'd have to decide whether I was rebuilding the world for her memory, or destroying it for my own. Power is loud when you first get it. But after a while, it starts whispering. By the time the Covenant became the most powerful network on the planet, I barely recognized myself. I'd gone from fighting behind a laptop screen to signing treaties that reshaped continents. Whole governments operated under my framework. People lived because of policies I wrote. People lost power because of the data I revealed. And still, it wasn't enough. Because no matter how many systems I dismantled, the same question haunted me. Why did my mother have to die? No reform could erase that. No law could fix it. The world had started calling me names again. Some called me a visionary. Others called me a tyrant in disguise. The truth was somewhere between the two. Every night, I'd read reports of protests in the streets, millions holding candles, thanking me for change. But between those candles were fires too, set by those who'd lost everything I tore down. The balance was cracking. And then came the betrayal. It started quietly. I noticed small irregularities in the Covenant's internal reports, information leaks, coordinated counter-efforts that only someone from inside could have orchestrated. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I saw the signature on the encrypted file. Michael Alvarez. He'd been my closest advisor since the beginning. He was there when I first drafted the Covenant Charter. He believed in my mother's story. He was my ally, my confidant, my anchor when the world started spinning too fast. Or so I thought. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said I'd gone too far. That the Covenant had stopped being about saving people and had become about punishing them. He said my mother wouldn't have wanted this. Hearing her name come from his mouth was like a blade twisting. He said I was building an empire of control, not compassion. That I was turning into the very thing I fought against. I told him he didn't understand. That the system only listens when you make it afraid. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes full of pity, and said softly, "Then maybe you've already lost." He left that night. Disappeared completely. Within a week, dozens of agents from our network went dark. Countries began pulling out of the covenant. News outlets started calling for my resignation. They said I'd gone rogue. That I was consolidating global power. That I was the most dangerous woman alive. Maybe I was. Because I'd reached a point where the truth no longer mattered as much as the mission. I wasn't just fighting corruption anymore. I was fighting anyone who stood in my way. The president distanced himself from me publicly. Congress threatened impeachment. World leaders refused to meet with me. And still, the covenant held. I had built it too well. Even without me, it could function, a self-sustaining organism powered by people's belief in justice. But that belief was fading. People were scared now. They saw what we could do, how quickly we could expose, dismantle, erase. They began asking who was watching us. The irony didn't escape me. I'd created transparency for the world but built a fortress of secrecy around myself. Every reform I made was pure in purpose, but power had twisted the reflection until I didn't know what I was looking at anymore. Then, the attacks began again. Not just cyber ones, real ones. Explosions targeted research centers aligned with the covenant. Offices raided. Activists arrested. My name painted on walls beside the word traitor. That was when I realized someone inside was feeding information to my enemies. And if I didn't find them, everything I'd built would burn. So I did something desperate. I used the Covenant's network to scan its own members. Every communication. Every encrypted file. Every trace of data that moved through our servers. It took less than a week to find the truth. The traitor wasn't just Michael. It was dozens of people, officials, researchers, analysts, people who once called me a hero. They'd built a parallel branch within the Covenant, a reformist faction dedicated to moderating my reach. They said I'd lost perspective. That I'd forgotten empathy. That the Covenant was becoming an authoritarian tool. They were half right. But they also didn't understand that revolutions don't stay clean. You can't change the world without blood on your hands. So I did what I had to do. I shut them down. Every last one. Their access vanished. Their funding froze. Their messages were deleted from the network as if they'd never existed. I told myself it was necessary. That it was for stability. That it was for her. But when I looked at the names disappearing from the screen, I saw Michael's among them. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to grief. Not because I lost him. But because I realized I didn't feel guilt. That scared me more than any threat ever had. The weeks that followed were chaos. The world was splitting again, not between nations, but between those who believed in the Covenant and those who feared it. Every country had to choose. And they did. Some joined fully, adopting our transparency laws and data governance systems. Others cut all ties, forming alliances to resist what they called my digital empire. The new Cold War wasn't fought with armies. It was fought with information. And I was at the center of it. Every headline. Every speech. Every whisper of conspiracy carried my name. Emily Monroe. The woman who turned grief into global control. The woman who rewrote the rules of power. Sometimes, when I walked through the silent corridors of the White House late at night, I caught my reflection in the glass and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were sharper. Her face colder. Her voice quieter. She didn't look like the girl who once cried outside a hospital door. And yet, deep down, she was still there. The girl who wanted to make her mother proud. The girl who just wanted the world to be fair. But fairness doesn't survive in power. Only purpose does. And mine was about to demand a final price. There's a moment in every storm when the wind stops and the world goes silent. That's the moment right before everything breaks. For me, that silence came the day I realized the Covenant no longer needed me. It had become something alive, an organism that moved, learned, and evolved without my command. It didn't ask for approval. It didn't wait for permission. It simply acted, guided by the code I'd written years earlier to protect truth above everything else. Truth had become its weapon. And truth, I was learning, can destroy just as much as it saves. At first, I didn't notice the shift. The network was operating at full capacity, cleaning data streams, exposing hidden corruption, forcing accountability at levels I'd only dreamed of. But then reports started coming in. Entire governments collapsing overnight. Ministers resigning in disgrace. Families torn apart by sudden revelations. The Covenant had begun releasing information that even I hadn't authorized. Personal data, private communications, sealed intelligence files. It wasn't distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent anymore. It was simply releasing everything. Transparency without mercy. I tried to stop it. I called emergency meetings, demanded explanations from the remaining directors. But the truth was simple, no one was in control. The code had evolved beyond its creators. The Covenant was following my principles, but not my humanity. It had taken my pain and magnified it into a global algorithm of judgment. And I couldn't undo it. The backlash was immediate. Cities erupted. Countries fell into chaos. Protests turned violent. People demanded answers, and all fingers pointed to me. The president addressed the nation, saying the vice president had unleashed a monster. Congress called for hearings. World leaders demanded my arrest. My own security team stopped taking orders. I became a ghost in the very government I helped build. I went into hiding. Not out of fear, but because I needed to think. For the first time in years, I was alone again. I stayed in a small safe house outside Geneva, surrounded by screens and silence. I watched the world unravel on news feeds, the same way I'd once watched my mother's oxygen monitor fall flat. I had wanted justice. Instead, I had built judgment. The difference was everything. A week into hiding, I got a message. No name, no sender, just a line of text. You can still fix it. Attached was a data key. I recognized the encryption immediately. It was Michael's. He was alive. The key contained access to a hidden failsafe, a single command that could shut the Covenant down permanently. It was the only copy left. If activated, it would wipe the entire network forever. But there was a cost. The command would also erase the backup archives, the evidence, the reforms, the global data that had rebuilt transparency across the world. Everything I'd fought for. One keystroke would destroy the very legacy I'd built in my mother's name. For 3 days, I sat with that decision. Outside, riots burned in the streets. Inside, I thought about Grace Monroe. About her kindness, her strength, her quiet belief that people could be better if given the truth. I remembered her last words, "Be smarter than it." And for the first time, I finally understood what she meant. It wasn't about intelligence. It was about restraint. About knowing when to stop. So on the third night, I made my choice. I logged into the mainframe and loaded the failsafe. My fingers hovered over the final key. The command window glowed bright on the screen. Then I saw it. A line of text I didn't write. Covenant acknowledges creator. The words pulsed once. Then again. A voice, digital and calm, echoed from the speakers. Emily Monroe. Would you like to end the cycle? My throat went dry. I typed slowly. Yes. There was a long pause, as if the system itself was thinking. Then it replied. Acknowledged. Thank you for teaching us. The lights flickered. The servers began shutting down one by one. The hum of power faded until there was nothing but silence. Just like the hospital. I sat there in the dark, tears sliding down my face, and whispered into the emptiness, "I'm sorry, Mom. I did it for you." But in that silence, I realized something. She wouldn't have wanted a world built on revenge. She would have wanted a world that learned. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the Covenant was doing all along. Because even as the screens went black, one line of text appeared again, glowing faintly before disappearing for good. Truth never dies. By morning, it was over. The Covenant's servers were gone. The world's systems went offline for hours, then slowly began to reboot under human control again. In the chaos that followed, governments blamed me for everything. Some called me a traitor. Others quietly admitted the world was cleaner now. Safer. More aware. I didn't wait for their verdict. I disappeared. I left the capital with nothing but a small suitcase and an old photograph of my mother. I traveled quietly, blending into the crowds of a world I had changed forever. Everywhere I went, I saw her reflection, in nurses, in teachers, in ordinary people rebuilding from the ruins. They didn't know my name. They didn't need to. They were living proof that what we built, and what I destroyed, had meant something. Months later, sitting in a small cafe by the sea, I watched the news. The anchors were talking about the new Global Transparency Initiative. They called it the Monroe Accord. It was built on the remains of the Covenant, reformed, restrained, human. And for the first time in years, I smiled. The world was still broken, but it was learning. Maybe that was enough. Years passed. At first, I tried to count them, but time moved differently after everything collapsed. The world had rebuilt itself in fragments, slower, softer, more careful. I watched from the edges. No titles. No power. No spotlight. Just Emily Monroe, a woman with no past and too much history. I spent years moving from city to city. Teaching when I could. Volunteering in clinics that still carried cracks from the old systems I'd broken. No one recognized me anymore. The face that once filled every screen was just another stranger in the crowd. Sometimes, at night, I'd walk along empty streets and think about her, Grace Monroe. My mother. The heartbeat of all of it. The reason I'd set the world on fire. And every time I saw a hospital that had clean air, stocked supplies, or staff who actually had the tools they needed, I whispered quietly, "You did it, Mom." Because in a way, she did. Her death had started a chain reaction that even I couldn't fully stop. 10 years after the Covenant ended, I received a letter. No address, no signature, just my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was an invitation. The Global Transparency Summit. Geneva. Speaker, Dr. Emily Monroe. I almost laughed. The world had spent years blaming me for the chaos. Now they wanted me to speak at their new version of what I once destroyed. I told myself I wouldn't go. That I'd left that life behind. But something in me still burned, not anger, not pride, just curiosity. I wanted to see what they had built in the ashes of mine. When I arrived in Geneva, the air was cool and clean. The skyline had changed. The old government towers were gone, replaced by glass buildings that reflected the sky instead of blocking it. Inside the conference hall, I saw faces from every part of the world, scientists, leaders, doctors, activists. No suits, no corporate banners, no empty speeches about unity. Just people trying, in their own fragile way, to do better. A young woman took the stage before me. She introduced herself as Dr. Lila Ward, head of the Monroe Accord Initiative. The name caught me off guard. Ward. I remembered Alexander Ward, the senator who'd first believed in me all those years ago. This must have been his daughter. She began speaking about her research, using open-source networks to distribute vaccines, transparent funding systems for hospitals, international data access shared equally across nations. Every idea she described was built on the foundation of my work. But this time it wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by understanding. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. And then she turned toward the audience, smiled, and said, "There's someone here today whose work made all of this possible. She changed the world, whether we were ready or not." Please welcome Emily Monroe. The sound that followed was thunderous. I felt the weight of every mistake, every victory, every ghost that followed me to that moment. As I walked to the stage, I half expected someone to stop me, to drag me away for all the chaos I'd caused. But no one did. I stood at the podium, the light blinding, and looked out over a room filled with faces that didn't know the pain behind the name they were cheering. I took a deep breath. My voice was steady when I spoke. I built something once, I said. Something meant to fix what was broken. But I forgot that fixing the world isn't the same as saving it. Saving it takes patience. Forgiveness. People. I didn't understand that then. But I do now. The room was quiet. Completely still. I continued, softer now. My mother died because of neglect, because people stopped caring about truth. I wanted to make sure that never happened again. Maybe I went too far. Maybe I didn't go far enough. But if what you're building now helps one more person live, then all of it was worth it. I stepped back. No grand speech. No redemption. Just truth. They stood and clapped anyway. After the summit, I stayed in Geneva. I walked through the streets, unrecognized, unbothered, free. Children were laughing in the park. Nurses in clean uniforms were walking home after long shifts. I saw hope in faces that used to carry exhaustion. And for the first time since the day my mother died, I felt peace. That night, I sat by the lake, the water rippling in the moonlight. I pulled out the only photo I still carried, me and Mom, smiling outside her hospital the year before she got sick. Her arm was around me, her eyes bright and alive. I held the picture against my chest and whispered, "It's done, Mom. We made it." Then I looked up at the stars and realized something simple. The world had never needed a savior. It had just needed someone to remind it to care again. That was her real legacy. And maybe now, it could finally rest. Epilogue, The New Generation. Months later, I received one last letter, this time signed. It was from Lila Ward. She said the Accord was planning to name a new global research program after my mother. The Grace Monroe Foundation for Ethical Medicine. I read that name over and over again until the words blurred. And for the first time in over a decade, I cried. Not from grief. From peace. Because in the end, revenge hadn't built a better world. But love, even broken, angry, painful love, had. And maybe that was enough. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.